Welcome back, everybody. I'm joined by Dr. Yoichiro Sato of Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Japan, where he is Dean of the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies. Previously, he has also taught at the U.S. Department of Defense's Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Auckland University in New Zealand, Kansai Gaidai Hawaii College, and the University of Hawaii. Please pick up copies of Dr. Sato's books in order to understand Japan's national security policy. My two favorite of his books are The Rise of China and International Security, as well as Identity, Culture, and Memory in Japanese Foreign Policy. Dr. Sato's Twitter feed contains many important updates of the issues of the day. His Twitter address is @Yoichiro Sato 2. So again, @Yoichiro Sato 2. Professor Sato, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Absolutely. We wanted to have you back as we approach Japan's upper house elections, which will take place in July. And a poll conducted by Kyodo News in June shows that roughly 64% of voters are dissatisfied with the government's response to inflation. A contributing factor to inflation in Japan is the weak yen, which is at a 20-year low. Is this negative voter sentiment expected to hurt candidates running for office who represent Prime Minister Kishida's ruling coalition in the upper house?
In general, the inflation works against the incumbent government and the ruling party candidates, but I think its negative effect will be pretty limited. I mean, for sure, inflation is actually quite bad. It's the post-corona reaction to the government's large public spending and increasing debt, and then the exchange rate is changing, against the Japanese yen's value vis-a-vis foreign currencies. So a lot of imported materials going up in price. And for example, I drive a hybrid car, which only pumps like 25 liters of regular gasoline, but I'm still paying almost the same amount for filling my previous car, which was an old BMW, which gulps high octane gasolines like crazy. And every time the gas price costs about the same. So I really feel the pain, and I'm glad that I no longer drive that car. So, and other things like wheat products price are going up, the pastas and bread and the okonomiyaki mix, you probably know. That's the kind of a mixed flour for making Japanese style pancake-like cuisine. And so, yeah, the supermarket bills are coming up, and you can see it if you shop often enough. But having said that, the opposition parties have not been very successful at capturing this and turn it into anti-LDP platform. And part of that, I think, is that some of the opposition parties are not located on the left of the ideological spectrum compared to the ruling LDP, but they're conservative oppositions, and they're not criticizing the government for inflation or those daily the living issues. Whereas all the left parties such as the Socialist Party, Communist Party. They're trying to attack the government based on those the consumer issues. But I think those old leftist parties have lost the steam long time ago, and they still hold the support of a small minority, but they have not been able to regain their ground into the kind of centrist majority of the population for at least last 30, 40 decades. I mean, 30, 40 years. Yeah.
Professor Sato, is the upper house ruling coalition expected to maintain its majority? And if so, what are some of the reasons for their expected success?
Okay. Yeah, I think the current coalition of the Liberal Democratic Party and the NATO will likely retain the majority in the upper house. The LDP currently has 110 seats, and the Komeito holds 28 seats, for a total of 138 seats for the ruling coalition, out of currently 243 seats. There are a couple of vacant seats right now. So after the election, we are expecting a total of 248 seats in the parliament. So, so out of that, even the current strength has a majority, and the ruling coalition is expected to gain a couple of seats. And out of the opposition parties, only the Ishin no Kai, the Restoration Party, is expected a significant gain, and other parties, smaller parties, they're all losing a few seats or remaining about the same strength, according to several estimates by political pundits. So, so most likely the current coalition will have a simple majority, not quite a 2/3 majority. And the 2/3 majority is significant because that's a number required for constitutional reform in both the lower house and upper house. And the current coalition doesn't have it, but there are, as I mentioned, a couple of conservative opposition parties, and they are willing to cooperate with the ruling coalition on the issue of constitutional amendment. And if those parties win, then together with the ruling coalition, there might be a 2/3 majority bloc in the upper house after this election. And those two parties are the National Democrat Party, which currently holds 12 seats and expected to lose a few seats, but still a sizable group. And the Restoration Party, as I said, is expected to gain, currently at 15, but the party will be the biggest winners of all of the opposition parties. So if they cooperate, we can expect that the number comes pretty close to 2/3 majority.
Prime Minister Kishida is criticized by the opposition for what they call Kishida inflation. Is this argument having any effect? And what are the candidates for the upper house election saying they will do to address the rise in the cost of living?
Well, the leftist parties are attacking the government by saying that the consumption tax should be abolished. And this is really an old call those leftist parties have used for a long time. They, when the consumption tax was first introduced in 1989, that's long time ago, long time ago. And that was the time the Socialist Party gained pretty much double the number of seats in the lower house by objecting to the introduction of the consumption tax. But they misunderstood the public sentiment based on this. They thought they could just continue on that platform and continue to be opposing the ruling party on all other issues. But that wasn't the case. And the socialists in the next election really lost seats big time. And since then, the Socialist Party has been on the path of eternal decline. And today it's in such a, the minimized state of being, which is really unimaginable from the days of the 1960s and 1970s, when the socialists held about half the seats of the LDP, and it was the biggest opposition party. So the Communist Party is the same way. It's opposing the consumption tax and trying to criticize the government for the current inflation. But people do understand that the consumption tax is necessary in order to fund the growing spending for the national pension scheme. And the Japan's demographic shift, the old people's proportion is increasing and young working population is shrinking. So there's no other way but to shift the tax burden more onto the consumption tax. So in that sense, the opposition parties' criticism of the government is not gathering enough strength.
Prime Minister Kishida is under pressure to pass a second supplementary budget of 10 trillion yen, which is approximately 77 billion US dollars, to take place after the upper house elections for purposes of helping to finance measures to stimulate the economy, as well as to help Japanese citizens mitigate the effects of inflation. How are voters reacting to this idea, and has it been an effective campaign issue for the ruling coalition?
Yeah, the Kishida's proposal is no different from the traditional LDP style pork barreling, and this tactic preempt the opposition parties' appeal to the voters in lower economic strata. So the various kind of life support subsidies have been provided to small business owners and single parent with little children and so forth, and the people who lost jobs during the pandemic. And those schemes are, coming to the end because they were pandemic specific, but the same group of people who need continuous support from the government, they will benefit from this the spending bonanza by the Kishida government. And by preempting these voices, the Kishida is actually countering the potential exploitation of these issues by the opposition parties.
Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party proposed to double the country's defense spending within the next 5 years in a recent defense policy document. This is in wake of Japan observing Ukraine's situation after Putin's invasion and how the war may offer cautionary lessons on China's ambitions to invade Taiwan, a development that, if it were to occur, would threaten Japan's security. The same document also called for the development of a counterattack capability that can target enemy bases or command and control systems. Professor Sato, is the proposed defense spending boost an issue that is being discussed in the upper house campaigns? And how much is national security a topic of debate?
The security issue is in the background, and the defense spending issues also are very much on the headlines of the newspapers and so forth. But it has not become a main issue in this election. I think deliberately the ruling coalition is avoiding discussing the constitutional reform during the election campaign, because which is a potentially a negative appeal to the voters. So they are not going to do any kind of, the major push for the amendment until after the election's over. And because of that, there's no concrete amendment proposal or draft or anything like that, except the draft LDP produced several years ago under Prime Minister Abe. So without the draft proposal, the opposition parties have no scarecrow to beat. So that's one of the reasons it's somewhat difficult for the opposition parties to attack the ruling party. They are, do you remember the heavyweight boxer, the Barabin?
Mm-hmm.
You can punch him, but he's so flowery that
Yeah.
it doesn't cause damage.
Right.
Yeah, so that's what the opposition parties are feeling, I think. And the government did mention, up to 2% on defense spending, 2% of GDP on defense spending. But that's not the figure the government will, propose for next year's defense budget, for example. The time frame for increasing to 2% is not specified. And the 2% simply came from the NATO standard, the European allies of the United States in NATO were, basically they made a promise that they will spend 2% of the GDP on defense. Mm-hmm. By the way, which they didn't really abide by until Russians, started invading Ukraine. And now Europeans are waking up and spending more. But Japan hasn't set the time frame for reaching the 2% threshold, and it will be a very incremental process. And you mentioned that the counterstrike capability by Japan and Taiwan contingency, those are a very important issue as well. Let me talk first about the counterstrike capability, because that became an issue during the government of not Kishida, but Suga government, from the end of Abe administration to the beginning of the Suga government, that the defense minister Kono canceled the land-based interceptor program called Aegis Ashore. And this was supposed to be part of Japan's overall missile defense profile. But there was a local opposition at the deployment site, and the Kono canceled the whole program, and that triggered a debate about what should be the alternative to Japan's missile defense. And there were some discussions about alternative tactical platforms, but that really didn't reach a definite conclusion. And the debate expanded to discuss revising the kind of broader strategy for missile defense. And that's when the counterstrike issues came about. And basically, you know, it is very costly to shoot down an incoming ballistic missile. And if Japan maintains this, the defensive defense doctrine, which Japan has held since the end of the World War II, then, you know, Japan will always suffer from the cost disadvantage in defense. So some started arguing that the possession of limited counter-strike capability is not necessarily unconstitutional. So they started discussing the possible scenarios in which Japan could exercise a counter-strike capability. And so out of this debate, there have been some discussions about new weapons procurement, whether it's you know, the cruise missile, Tomahawk missile, or maybe another air-launched, domestically produced air-launched missiles in a modified form. And so Japan will obtain a limited ground attack capability in that sense. And it would be a part of the overall missile defense posture in the coming years. And the increased defense budget will definitely help Japan procure those the new types of weapons. And now let me move on to Taiwan. The Taiwan Strait contingencies. It was a big issue during the Quad summit, and also Prime Minister Suga's visit to Washington, D.C. Before the current Kishida government. And Japan has carefully avoided being explicit about Japan's role in the collective defense over the Taiwan Strait contingency. But at the same time, in the secrecy, they have most likely discussed more detailed plan of joint actions, yeah, which they will not make public because there's nothing really to gain from making it public. But at the same time, I think the US has shifted slightly toward the more explicit statement of its position on the Taiwan Strait. And the President Biden and the State Department have been kind of acting this routinized, issuing of statements, kind of provocative statement by Biden and soon to be followed by retractions by the State Department bureaucrats. And this has become a routine. And behind the scene, Japan is very much towing the US routine by cementing a closer cooperation with the US in defense of Taiwan.
Professor Sato, what were the reasons Prime Minister Kishida attended the current NATO summit in Madrid, Spain?
I think that the European involvement in the Indo-Pacific security, which started some, decade ago, first through actually even earlier, because when the US attacked Taliban in Afghanistan, the Europeans sent their naval ships to the Indian Ocean region to, take part in a coalition effort to patrol against the smuggling activities by Al-Qaeda terrorists and so forth. So, so that was two decades ago that the Europeans, took part in the Indian Ocean coalition. And the anti-piracy operation of Somalia, again, the Europeans were very important components of this security effort to ensure the safe passage through the major sea lanes, which connects the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean region. So on the extension of those European involvement, we now see that Europeans see this Indo-Pacific region as a growth center of the world economy, and Europe wants to be part of it rather than confining itself in Europe. So they want to ensure that they have some presence in the region, and also they're concerned very much about Russia, and legitimately so, given the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But the Europeans are also concerned that if something major happens in the Indian Ocean region or the Indo-Pacific broadly, including the Korean Peninsula, South China Sea, the US will be preoccupied to deal with the East Asian region, and their attention may shift away from Europe. And Europeans really felt it when Obama announced the rebalancing, the pivot to Asia and so forth. And Trump told the Europeans that, unless Europe increase the defense budget, US is going to pull out troops from Europe. And so Europeans are feeling this, the possible abandonment by the United States. So they want to make this, alignment broader. They're not talking about recruiting Asian countries as full members into NATO, but they are talking about enhancing closer cooperation between NATO and major US allies and friends in Asia. So it's not only that the Kishida wants to get the European attention, the Europeans also wants to develop closer partnerships with Japan as well. So I think the mutual interests do exist in this the ongoing approach between the European countries and Japan.
On June 25, Japan, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom launched what they called Partners in the Blue Pacific, PBP, a group that will seek to support Pacific Island countries, mainly helping them strengthen their economic ties with the rest of the world. Dr. Sato, what are some of the reasons behind the forming of this group, and what details have the Kishida administration provided? Is it out of concern for China's influence in the region?
Yes, definitely. The China launched the Belt and Road Initiative back in 2014 or so, and since then, China provided infrastructure loans to developing countries in the South Pacific, in Southeast Asia, and in the Indian Ocean region, African coast. And this turned into a political influence in certain locations. The countries are indebted, and those countries started selling their interests in the key port infrastructure in the case of Sri Lanka, for example. And now, Cambodia is building, the overseas naval base for Chinese, and the Solomon Island again is letting the Chinese Navy use its port. So this kind of the competition in infrastructure aid closely connected to influence in kind of military relations is ongoing, and Japan used to focus solely on economy, and economic aid was not necessarily closely aligned with the kind of coalition strategy to counter China. But the meeting like this symbolizes the new direction of Japanese aid, which is more closely aligned with the overall security strategy and security strategies of other like-minded states, especially in the Pacific region. The participation of Australia, New Zealand, Japan, together with the United States, this really coordinate their policy toward the South Pacific island states and some of the North Pacific island states as well, like Palau and the Micronesia and Marianas, and they're all having a similar issue of growing Chinese influence, more or less, and the Japan and US, Australia, New Zealand, they want to collectively counter this growing concern.
South Korea has a new president, President Yoon. He has expressed a new willingness to work with Tokyo. Where do you see Japan's relations with South Korea headed with this new administration in Seoul?
Very good point. I think Kishida's waiting for the right timing, and there is a kind of mutual interest in Korea and Japan between the conservative leaderships of the two countries that they need to kind of restart their cooperations first and foremost against the North Korean nuclear development, but in the longer term against the growing influence of China. This is an opportunity because South Korea was under the control of the progressive parties, not the conservative parties, and this the new South Korean regime opened the window for renewed cooperation. But for Japan, there are a couple of issues, and I think the South Korean and Japan, they had a finalized agreement on the issue of compensation for the comfort woman, which the South Korean government, previous government of South Korea basically threw away. And the Kishida needs to reconfirm that the agreement is still valid with this new government. And the new government hasn't done that, and it will take some political heat if they do that. The other issue is the compensation for the forced labor. And again, this was supposed to be a settled issue by the 1965 normalization agreement, but the South Korean court in this case ruled in favor of the workers' families. And so again, the Japanese government want the new government of South Korea to basically drop this against the Japanese companies. But this will be a tricky issue because court decisions and government decisions are two different things, and what can the government do about the court decision is not an easy issue for the South Koreans either. So with those two hurdles, the Kishida is taking a wait and see attitude in terms of approaching South Korea in the form of a bilateral summit meeting. But the leaders will be meeting, on the side of various international meetings and more practical, immediate cooperation, especially on the North Korean missile testing and so forth. North Korea is rumored to be preparing for another nuclear explosion test. And for things like that, regardless of, the resumption of a summit meeting or any kind of officialized negotiations, the two countries will keep talking and exchanging information.
Some argue that former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe casts a shadow over Japan's foreign policy. Is this accurate in your view? And as a follow-up, has current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida developed his own foreign policy doctrine?
Kishida government depends on the support from the faction within the LDP. led by former Prime Minister Abe. So in that sense, yes, Abe cast a long shadow over Kishida, but Kishida's trying to differentiate himself so that he will, emerge out of Abe's shadow, not be seen as Abe's puppet or anything like that. So he has done that domestically. Some of his economic policies kind of turning against Abe and bringing the LDP policy more back into the old days kind of a welfare state orientation. But in the foreign policy, I still don't see much difference between Abe and Kishida. And maybe, from their own personal beliefs level, there wasn't that much difference to begin with. I mean, Kishida is supposedly from a more liberal wing of the LDP, but the definition of being liberal within the LDP has really changed over the past 3 decades. And so in that sense, nobody is really as liberal as some of the liberal LDP leaders were back during the 1980s and 1990s.
We hear that Japan is in the middle of an awful heat wave, and that this June, which is typically the rainy season in Japan, was the hottest June on record for 150 years. All of this taking place amid energy pressures
Right.
that have various reasons, some relating to the war in Ukraine, and discussions that there might be needed power cuts. Is this affecting the Prime Minister's rating in the polls? And does this have any implications in the upcoming elections?
If the blackout happens between now and the election date, it is the government that will have to take the heat. But so far, that hasn't happened. And but it's true that the electricity supply is coming to a critical state, partly because we didn't get much rain this year during the rainy season of June. And many of the dams in the Kanto region, Shikoku and Kyushu, they have a very low level of the reserve water. And that also means that some of those, the hydroelectric plant will not be generating sufficient electricity. And the heat means that water evaporates faster and water supply becomes more critical. And also people will use ACs, and that will boost the electricity consumptions in the urban areas. So with all that, the government's already talking about the energy saving and encouraging people to seek, alternative ways of getting cool. So we'll see how we endure this summer.
So we are in summer, and
yeah,
Japan's summers are notoriously hot and humid. With the changing of the seasons in Japan, perhaps more than most countries, the cuisine changes, the food differs markedly between the seasons. So now that we're in summer, what foods are Japanese people eating? And
Yeah.
maybe more relevant, what are they drinking now that it's hot outside?
Oh yeah, good question. Well, the good thing is drinking outside has become possible again due to a declining number of the coronavirus infections. So the restaurants and bars are open. We are still being told not to have a big party, like, 20 people together and drinking and singing, those are, I mean, not banned, but not encouraged either. But meanwhile, this is the time of the year, the many of the unagi restaurants are having campaign.
Eel.
Unagi is, yes, freshwater eel.
Okay.
And it's steamed and grilled with teriyaki sauce on it. And in summer, especially, when our bodies are fatigued from the heat, we're supposed to eat this the grilled eel and regain some strength.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, eel price has been very high for maybe almost a decade by now. Yeah, there is I think a case of overfishing, and the juvenile eels are caught at the river mouth and then brought into the pen for fish farming.
Okay.
Yeah, but the juvenile catch is really shrunk, and so much so that some mobsters are actually getting into the business by illegally catching a juvenile eelfish.
Is that right? The Yakuza.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So but once a year to enjoy expensive eel is still happening. But it's really fatty and heavy, so some people just rather go for a cold bowl of soba.
Okay.
Buckwheat noodle.
Yeah, that sounds refreshing.
Yes.
And any particular beverages that Japanese will drink during the summer?
Oh, beer, I should say.
Okay.
Yeah, the beer companies really suffered during the pandemic, but I think this summer they will regain their market share.
Yeah, making up for lost time.
That's right.
Well, Dr. Sato, as always, thank you. You always help to provide insight into these important issues affecting Japanese politics, its national security posture, but also the food scene, which I have particular interest in. Above all, it's great seeing you once again. And as always, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ted.
Be well.
Thank you, you too.